The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Not a good appearance for the American president at the NATO summit in Europe. Let's start with Emmanuel Macron, who is, of course, the newly elected president of France, decisively defeated right-wing candidate Marine Le Pen, and he is very decisively making himself heard and seen on the world stage, really making our president look bad in a number of ways. He took office a couple weeks ago. He's already speaking out about sort of insightful observation he's made about American President Donald Trump. He gave an interview to a French newspaper over the weekend, and Macron pointed out that when it comes to diplomacy, Donald Trump basically sees his relationships with foreign leaders in terms of who has the most power. And we see this in what he says. We see it in his attempts to do certain types of handshakes, which, believe me, we're going to get to the handshakes on today's show. And Macron compared Trump to other authoritarian heads of state, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Turkish President Erdogan, who were also diplomatically arrogant, to say the least. You'll recall that Emmanuel Macron's campaign was hacked during the French election, presumably, it appears, by Russian actors. And Macron seems to want to have more integrity than what we've seen from Trump and actually challenge that behavior. And it's really funny how among some right-wing circles in the United States, France has been framed over the last 15 years as weak, as feminized, those feminized French men. France now has a president that is the one dominating the dialogue with respect to characters like Donald Trump and dominating the handshakes as well. But again, we'll get to that. I don't want to get ahead of myself on the handshakes. Here is French President Emmanuel Macron in the Journal du Dimanche, where he said, quote, Donald Trump, the Turkish president, or the Russian president see relationships in terms of a balance of power. That doesn't bother me. I don't believe in diplomacy by public abuse, but in my bilateral dialogues, I won't let anything pass. And he makes a good point, which is, although Trump probably sees diplomacy in the same way that Putin and Erdogan do, Putin and Erdogan are much better at it than is Donald Trump. And we're seeing that just about every day. Macron was asked about how he, something about that tense handshake that he had with Donald Trump at the NATO summit in Brussels. And indeed, this was a moment where, Trump is famous for his aggressive, domineering handshakes. And we're showing you here what it looked like when Donald Trump shook hands with Emmanuel Macron. Wherever Trump goes, he tries to make himself seem dominant over whoever he's shaking hands with. At the NATO meeting, French President Macron would not have that. And when they were shaking hands, it was very clear that Macron wanted to send a message to Trump that he was not going to be a pushover when it comes not only to handshakes, but also to relations between the U.S. and France. Here is their moment.
Congratulations, great job.
Thank you very much. So as you watch here, our TV audience seeing a long, confident handshake, squashing Donald Trump's tiny hands and looking very satisfied while doing so. Trump tries to pull away. Macron doesn't let him. I love it, right? Donald Trump cucked by Macron, number one. But, Pat, number two, we're going to get to in a second, and it's even worse. Macron actually said this was deliberate. He was asked about the entire handshake thing, and he again said in the Journal du Dimanche, quote, my handshake with him, it wasn't innocent. It's not the be-all and the end-all of a policy, but it was a moment of truth. So already, Pat, Trump's game's not working with Macron.
Well, obviously, whoever has the most domineering handshake has the superior country. So
obviously,
Trump was able to beat out Japanese leader Shinzo Abe.
Yes.
But of course, he lost the battle to Tajikistan's president.
Yes.
So it's always an ongoing battle.
That was just unbelievable. And we could do an entire show on handshakes, but we're not going to do that right now. Okay, so anyway, Emmanuel Macron, not the progressive be-all, end-all, to use his phrase, but by any means, but we should be glad that it was Emmanuel Macron sitting in this chair and not Marine Le Pen, who would have been singing Donald Trump's praises. But here's the real moment where Trump is just totally cucked by Macron. And it's just so funny because the alt-right, I say this, I'm joking around, right? The alt-right talks about this person's a cuck, that person's a cuck. There's no moment of greater cucking on the international diplomatic stage than what I'm about to play for you. At the NATO summit, Emmanuel Macron walking towards a group of world leaders, including Donald Trump, and it appears as though Macron is going right for Trump. Trump is ready because he's going to be the first person to be greeted by Emmanuel Macron, the big guy on campus, and then Macron swerves over and he hugs and kisses German Chancellor Angela Merkel, shakes another hand, looks like he's moving towards Trump, but then, he's back to the other side, and it is not Trump. Trump made to wait his turn, and you see Trump trying to do the pull-in handshake there, and it's too late. It's too late because he's been cucked, and it is, this is stunning. And then Donald Trump, like the little kid at the sandbox that used to be the bully, but now everybody else is saying, we don't really need the bully. We can do our own thing.
It's amazing because you can tell that these other world leaders are studying this. Of course, he had that domineering handshake with Neil Gorsuch and Chris Christie. So people like Prime Minister Justin Trudeau study it and they know how to react when he's going to make that aggressive handshake. So Trudeau grabs his shoulder. You have other world leaders pushing and pulling, all this stuff.
It's become a sort of game. And it's a game that Donald Trump actually started, and it completely, I mean, just embarrassingly. And this is only the visual aspect. I actually want to get now to the real diplomatic embarrassment of Trump at NATO. Donald Trump at NATO was an embarrassment to the United States of America. Donald Trump had this endless series of weird and bizarre moments at NATO in Brussels, Belgium last week. And when I say embarrassing, these would have been embarrassing moments to a normal person capable of being embarrassed. We're not sure, actually, if Donald Trump falls under that umbrella or not. So before taking the NATO heads of state photo on a stage, and we've got some pictures I'm going to walk you through here, all of the leaders were standing around sort of talking to one another. But according to a report, Trump just stood there silently, standing in the center without talking to anybody, just kind of awkwardly looking around, completely unable to interact with other world leaders in any reasonable way. My sense is he didn't have too many friends on that stage. And someone off to the side came up to take a picture. And the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, said, everybody wave. And everybody waves. This is really just no big deal. Except for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the one guy on the stage who just refuses to even react like he has any sense of what's going on around him. The photo was taken, which is the photo that I'm showing you. And afterwards, the heads of state sort of continued to talk to one another. But apparently nobody came up to talk to Donald Trump. And at one point, the NATO leaders were standing around in a hallway and the press were photographing them. And Donald Trump was kind of tucked in the back where the cameras couldn't really see him. As you can see in this picture, Trump's kind of in the back there. So what does Trump do? He shoves the president of Montenegro, Filip Vujanovic, out of the way so that he's all of a sudden standing at the front of the crowd, and he kind of adjusts his suit. I'm going to play the 8-second clip for you now. Yes. And then adjust the suit. I've never even heard of Montenegro. What is that? Some low energy, sad country? Get out of my way.
It's just the same thing as him talking on and on again about how he won the presidential election.
Yeah.
It's like he still has to prove something. And for a guy from Montenegro, a country he probably never even heard about, to be like in front of him, it just wasn't going to happen.
He was not going to be covered up by the president of Montenegro. So then Trump gives an embarrassing speech, rehashing one of his lines from the campaign. And he again talked at the summit about how NATO states aren't paying their fair share.
These grave security concerns are the same reason that I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations.
So what's Trump talking about here? Trump is complaining that the U.S. and 4 other NATO member nations spend 2% of their GDP on NATO, and that other countries pay less. Now, the thing is, this entire 2% thing has not been endorsed by any heads of state. The U.S. chooses to pay 2%. The U.S. can't tell other countries how to spend on the military. And this has not cost the U.S. more money. It's not a NATO rule. Trump is pretending it's a NATO rule. Trumpists, by the way, are falling for it. But as Gary J. Schmidt said, a scholar at the conservative American Enterprise Institute, quote, he doesn't care whether it's technically accurate, and it tends to bury the point that we're invested in European security for our own strategic reasons. Trump making a fool out of himself in front of these other world leaders with this routine.
Well, I saw that NATO members agreed in 2014 to start working towards spending 2% of their GDP on defense.
Yeah.
But it's only 2017 now. It's only been 3 years, and that was supposed to be in a 10-year period.
At the NATO summit, Trump also was refusing to support Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Article 5 states that all NATO member nations will come to the defense of any single NATO nation if they're under attack. Ever since NATO was created in 1949, every single U.S. president has supported this article. Every president since Harry Truman. It's sort of one of the main points of NATO. And people are concerned that Trump has been reluctant to support that article and that it has something to do with Russia, which is one of NATO's biggest adversaries. Russia's surrounded by NATO countries to the west. If Russia were to invade one of those countries, like it did Ukraine, which is not a NATO country, then all of the other NATO countries would presumably come to the defense of that country. And Trump apparently may not want that to happen. So Trump is complaining about other NATO countries not pulling their own weight when it comes to something that is not actually a NATO rule, the 2% thing. The U.S. is actually the one that looks like they're not the team player by not saying, hey, we support Article 5.
And of course, the only time that Article 5 was ever invoked was after 9/11, and it was for our benefit. So how could you not respond in kind if they were to be attacked?
Absolutely. Trump needs to get with the program when it comes to NATO. It's embarrassing. And have you noticed that Trump seems to enjoy himself a lot more when he's meeting with the Russians and the Saudis? Amongst his NATO colleagues, he did not seem to be having as good of a time. I'll remind you, here is Donald Trump with the Russians in the Oval Office. Same day he spilled secret info to them. Seems like a party with suspected Russian spy recruiter Sergei Kislyak. And then here's Donald Trump laughing it up in Saudi Arabia, where he actually danced. He danced with the Saudi diplomats, officials, call them what you want. And then he meets with NATO allies, and it's not clear whether he's annoyed or confused about what's going on around him. But needless to say, not having a very good time. Embarrassing. Donald Trump truly making the U.S. the NATO laughingstock in Brussels. Send me your thoughts about this. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Catherine Kern-Levine. Catherine, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Of course, membership, the #1 funding source for our program. You can join Catherine at davidpakman.com/membership. We have a coupon code available for you. It is IVoted17. It gives you a tidy little discount, pretty big discount actually, off of membership if you want it. We are also on the path to 2,000 pledges on Patreon at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Even as little as $1 a month supports the work that we do. And of course, if you ever shop on Amazon.com, support our show with the shopping you do by going to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop. All right, people who follow me on Instagram at david.pakman are probably aware that over the weekend, over the Memorial Day weekend, I was in Montreal, Canada, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Let's start with looking at the two most popular pictures from my Instagram account over the last week. Pat, first we have this still image, which took place while filming here in the studio, and I look absolutely shocked and perplexed here. And I posted it on Instagram saying, what must Pat have said that made me look this confused? And speculation was running wild.
You look angry. I mean, you look as if I just kicked your dog or insulted your entire family. I mean, that's a bad look. That's scary.
I guess the lesson to be learned is when you take live motion video, you can find still images that look really, really funny and odd.
It doesn't even look like I'm saying anything controversial.
No, you look very calm. And for some reason, I'm incredibly agitated. Also from my Instagram account, david.pakman, here is me drinking not coffee, Pat, but a beer in Montreal, Canada. And as we know, no matter what I post, there's criticisms. When I post pictures of me drinking coffee, David, coffee's not good for you. You should drink tea instead. It's not good to drink coffee. Then I post a beer and it's, oh, David's now an alcoholic. What happened to drinking coffee? He switched from coffee to beer. You just can't win on social media is what I'm learning.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of criticisms there. They could say that you're having the wrong style or brand of beer as well.
Sure. Yeah, and they did. Obviously, people saying, what kind of beer is that? It was a Kronenberg. And, you can't please everybody. And very often, you can't please anybody.
Doesn't sound very Canadian, too. Are you immersing yourself in the culture?
I think I did. I don't think that I neither. You have to be really careful these days. I did not participate in cultural appropriation while on my trip to French Canada, but I also did not participate in rejection of local culture either. So I think I struck the right balance during my trip to Montreal.
It's becoming harder and harder to do these days.
It really is, yeah. But anyway, I'll talk more on the bonus show about my trip. I'm on Instagram at david.pacman. Let me tell you a little story about Congressman Adrian Smith, a Republican from Nebraska. Congressman Smith was asked whether every American is entitled to eat during an interview with NPR's Scott Simon. Now, this is a really very interesting bit of insight into the overarching principles that dictate the views of many Republicans from really what's a moral level. And I want to dig into that in a moment. But first, we've got to just get the facts down. This was an interview on NPR about the Farm Bill and the proposed cuts that Donald Trump has to SNAP benefits, SNAP colloquially known as food stamps, in his budget proposal, seeking to cut close to $200 million over 10 years. That's about 25% of the program's cost over that period. Congressman Smith tried to focus on, oh, well, we can make small changes to this or that. But I'm glad that on NPR, he was actually pushed about what's the underlying principle here. Is every American entitled to eat? And Smith tries to divert with vagaries about nutrition is important, blah, blah, blah. But Scott Simon cuts to the chase and gets through, gets to the nonsense that underlies the principle. Let's take a listen here.
Well, I think at any time we're talking about food and nutrition, it's an important topic. And especially for people in need, we do not want to leave our most vulnerable without nutrition.
Right.
And looking at that, we always want to keep that in mind. We do know that the nutrition title of the Farm Bill is the largest one when it comes to the dollars.
Okay.
And so even very minor shifts can be very effective in terms of fiscal policy. And at the same time, make sure that we do not harm the most vulnerable among us.
Well, let me ask you this bluntly. Is every American entitled to eat?
Well, the nutrition, obviously, we know is very important, and I would hope that we can look
well, not just important, it's essential for life. Is every American entitled to eat?
It is essential. It is essential.
So is every American entitled to eat, and is food stamps something that ought to be that ultimate guarantor?
I think that we know that given the necessity of nutrition, there could be a number of ways that we could address that.
Yeah.
So you would vote for a budget that cuts food stamps?
I want to look at an entire budget, look at all of the details.
Yeah. Is every American entitled to eat? Well, we've determined nutrition is important. Yeah, you kind of can't survive without it. Given the necessity of nutrition, there could be any number of ways that we address that. Is every American entitled to breathable air? Doctors have told us air is important. And I think on that we can all agree. Right. But given that the air is so important, do we want to make sure that there's breathable air for everybody? This is another clown congressman. No shock there. But the big thing is, this is reflective of the worldview of people in the Republican Party. No, you're not entitled to eat unless you've earned it. It's terrible for our country as a whole to have people going hungry. Well, unless you've earned having food, you don't get food. And we've talked about this sort of strict father morality, as I call it, and as others call it as well, with abortion, right? Oh, you're against abortion? Hey, great news. We figured out how to reduce the number of abortions. You prevent pregnancies, and the way to do that is access to birth control and comprehensive sex education. Nope. You know why? Because on some level, morally, if you have sex, you deserve to have a baby.
Well, at least he didn't use that right-wing talking point that making people entitled to food would be tantamount to enslaving farmers, as Rand Paul uses when he's talking about healthcare.
This is part of the affliction that you're pointing out, Pat, of so-called fiscal conservatism, which is usually not conservative in the long run and is often completely immoral. With hunger, we can fix this. We could have fixed hunger a long time ago. If you look at food production, we've spoken to food experts on the program before. If you look at the number of calories produced every day on our planet, and you look at the number of people that live on our planet, pretty simple division equation, we have more than enough food now to feed everyone. But with food waste, as well as the lack of proper allocation of resources, we have people that are hungry. But it is a completely solvable problem. Should anyone be surprised that Congressman Smith answered in this way, or that there are Republicans who just don't believe everybody is entitled to eat? Obviously not. Look at what just happened in Montana. We're going to talk about that next. Montana elected a man to Congress the day after he body slammed a reporter for asking a question. So chances are that a guy who simply doesn't think everybody has a right to eat is also going to be an elected official. It's depressing to watch, but this is America today.
And, you know, Republicans justify increased military spending by saying, well, you know, all other freedoms come after our security and everything else is secondary.
Sure.
I think you can use the same logic when it comes to food. If you're not entitled to food, I don't think you're entitled to much else.
Who's going to be in the military if you don't have food? It's going to be tough. Obviously, that's not the people in the military have earned the right to eat. Not everybody has, apparently, according to Congressman Smith here. Absolutely disgusting. Let's follow up about the Montana story. Last week, we talked about Montana Republican candidate for the U.S. House of Representatives, Greg Gianforte, who body slammed a reporter from The Guardian at a campaign event the day before the election, charged with misdemeanor assault by the local sheriff's office, and 3 major newspapers pulled their endorsement of Gianforte. Here's just a reminder about what that sounded like.
And what you thought we'll talk to you about that later.
Yeah, but there's not going to be time. I'm just curious if you have the
speak
right
with
now.
Shane, please.
But you don't.
I'm sick and tired of you guys. The last guy that came in here, you did the same thing. Get the hell out of here. Get the hell out of here. The last guy did the same thing. You were the Guardian?
Yes, and you just broke my glasses.
The last guy did the same damn thing.
You just body slammed me and broke my glasses.
Get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
If you'd like me to get the hell out of here, I'd also like to call the police. Can I get you guys' names?
Hey, you gotta leave.
He just body slammed me.
You gotta leave.
Yeah. By the way, the sheriff whose department had to charge Gianforte donated to his campaign. So, of course, he wasn't handcuffed because of that. And because he's an incredibly wealthy white politician, imagine if this had been a 22-year-old black man suspected of body slamming a reporter from The Guardian. Would have been dealt with differently, that I can assure you. Anyway, Gianforte's campaign released a bogus statement responding to the incident, saying that this was a liberal journalist who was, in there aggressively asking questions. Everybody in the room, including Fox News reporters, said that that was absolutely not the way it happened. The way that the actual reporter said it happened is the real story. But like I said, voting day for this congressional election was the day after the incident. And Greg Gianforte is no longer a candidate, Pat. He is now U.S. Representative-elect for Montana's at-large congressional district, winning with 50.1% of the vote, a 6 percentage point victory over the Democratic opponent. This shouldn't surprise us for any number of reasons. Number one, Gianforte is a fundamentalist Christian and creationist Republican in Montana, and he was already ahead in the polls when he went into Election Day, despite the body slamming incident. Number two, it was, after all, the day before the election, and most people had probably already made up their minds pretty firmly about who they were going to vote for. And whatever reporting there was about the incident, many voters were not going to watch more news before voting. But I actually don't think that it's as if most voters didn't hear about it. It was national news. So importantly, and maybe most importantly, I would say, many Republicans right now are just not going to be deterred by this type of violent behavior from a politician. This is an implicit, a tacit endorsement of being violent against reporters, as long as you check the right boxes in terms of, by the way, they claim to hate identity politics. They love it when you're talking about this particular identity. The violence is acceptable at this point.
Yeah, I think there are some Republicans who voted for Gianforte despite the fact that he body slammed a reporter.
Yeah.
And there are also Republicans who actually kind of enjoyed that behavior. You have Rush Limbaugh saying that Gianforte is a manly and studly guy and that he body slammed a reporter who was a pajama boy millennial.
Yep.
And then a live caller called into his program and said that his chances of voting for Republicans would grow exponentially if more of them did this.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And thanks to Donald Trump and the 2017 Republican Party in the U.S., this is the type of thing that we are seeing as increasingly acceptable every day. And by the way, what countries is this reminiscent of, where journalists are attacked? It's, I've just read Narconomics, and you should see how journalists who want to report on the drug crimes in parts of Mexico are dealt with. They're killed, and so are their families. We know about what happens with adversarial journalists in, Vladimir Putin's Russia. In the U.S., it is now acceptable for a billionaire politician to physically attack a newspaper reporter. This is a historically dangerous track that we are on, and the attitude that we're seeing from Republican voters is as much a part of the problem as Gianforte's actions.
And I thought the Republicans were the law and order types, the constitutionalists. Apparently that doesn't apply when you're going against reporters and are able to undermine freedom of the press.
Yeah, but it was an attack dog liberal yellow journalist, Pat. All law and order goes out the window when that's the case.
And the guy is clearly unstable, too. There's no break in between when he tells the reporter to go speak to Shane, the guy who works for him, and when he body slams. It was direct. It makes you think that he has something going on.
There's something going on. Yeah, that's the understatement of the century. This guy's got something going on, all right. A lot of discussions about this on Reddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Robert Zubrin, who's an aerospace engineer, author, and also one of the driving forces behind the Mars Direct project, which is a proposal to reduce both the cost and complexity of a mission to Mars. So, Robert, let's just start at sort of the top. Other proposals to go to Mars, in what ways are they more complex than maybe they need to be?
Well, the classic example of an overcomplex program was the NASA 90-day report, which said before we could go to Mars, we had to build a space station, we had to build hangars on the space station, we had to build a lunar base, we had to develop advanced propulsion, we had to somehow use the lunar base in support of the advanced propulsion spaceships that would be built at the space station, and so forth. And that created a 30-year timeline and a $400 billion price tag. Now, NASA recently topped that by coming up with a new idea, which they hadn't even hit on in the 90-day report, which is that they want to build a space station in lunar orbit too, the purpose of which is there is no purpose for which. So basically, in the 90-day report, they were really spending money in order to give everyone's pet program a role in the plan. It's like rewriting Shakespeare's plays to give everyone in the school a part. But in this case, frankly, they weren't spending money to do things at all. They were just doing things to spend money.
And talk to us about when we think about the Mars Direct proposal, and we'll dig into some of the details and the different phases and aspects of it. One of the most notable aspects of it to me is that it does not require the development of any new technology that we don't currently have access to. Is that right?
Well, no new fundamental technology. There's certainly new pieces of hardware in it. A heavy lift booster, a large Mars lander, and so forth. But we're not talking Los Alamos 1943 here. We're venturing into new realms of physics. We're talking about taking our craft of aerospace engineering and applying it to design larger things better backed up and so forth than what we've already built, but things of the same kind. And So the first thing I would say about Mars Direct is, number one, its orientation, which is that it's mission driven. We're not trying to give everyone a part in the play. We're not trying to run our business to please our vendors. Okay, we are trying to get to Mars, and we want to actually do it with as few critical technologies, as few vendors as possible, not with the maximum number. Okay, so there's that it is simply a much sparer approach. That is, the mentality behind it is we're doing the mission to do the mission, not to make a bunch of people happy by giving them a part in the mission. Second thing is the actual approach itself, which makes use of Martian resources. It was our philosophy in designing the Mars Direct plan that the very things that make Mars interesting can also be what makes it attainable. That is how exploration on Earth has been supported in the past. You know, in other words, Lewis and Clark never could have crossed America, 27 men, unless they hunted their way across. They obviously used local water, local air. In some cases, they traded with Native Americans for resources, but in all cases, they were using the resources present in the environment that they were operating in. If they had attempted to bring all their food, water, and air, they would have needed a wagon train of supplies for every man and for every horse. So then they would have needed further wagon trains for all the men and horses in the wagon trains, and on and on. It would have been an impossible mission.
And Robert, so, the way that, if I understand correctly, the way that that concept relates to your proposal is that we would actually use, your plan would use Martian resources for the return back to Earth. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is the way the mission works. Is first we shoot an Earth return vehicle to Mars. We can do that with one launch of a heavy lift vehicle that goes and it lands on Mars unfueled. It then makes its return fuel automatically out of the Martian atmosphere, which is carbon dioxide and water. We can turn carbon dioxide and water into methane, which is natural gas, is good fuel, and oxygen, which is the oxidizer to burn the fuel. So once you have a fully fueled Earth return vehicle waiting for you on Mars, then you shoot the crew out to Mars. And once again, that's a one-way launch, one launch of a heavy lift booster. It goes and it lands near the Earth return vehicle. They use the habitat that they fly to Mars in as their house on Mars, as their base on Mars. At the end of a year and a half of exploring on Mars, they get in the Earth return vehicle and they fly home. Each time you do this, you add another habitat to the base. And before you know it, you've built the beginning of the first human settlement on a new world. There is nothing in this that's fundamentally beyond our technology. That's a pretty brief explanation of the plan. If people want to know in great detail, I have a whole book on the subject called The Case for Mars.
In the book, The Case for Mars, you talk not only about sort of the approach from a technical standpoint, but also you make the case for why it would be important to go to Mars. So in your estimation, what is interesting about Mars? What are the reasons to go to Mars?
Well, there's three reasons to go to Mars. There's the science, there's the challenge, and there's the future. The science is finding out whether we're alone in the universe. Mars was once a warm and wet planet. If it's true that life evolves out of chemistry wherever it has the right kind of environment, Mars had that environment. The environments on Mars and Earth were essentially the same in the period that life first appeared on Earth. So if life appears out of chemistry wherever you have the correct conditions, like water freezing to ice on a cold night, it happens for sure, okay? Then life should have appeared on Mars. And if that's the case, then life is all over the universe. And since we now know the basic laws of evolution, drive life to develop more complex, more capable, more active forms, capable of more activity, intelligence, ever more rapid evolution. If life's everywhere, it means intelligence is everywhere. It means we're not alone. On the other hand, if we go to Mars and we find out that despite the fact that it had very similar conditions to the primitive Earth, no life appeared there, that can mean that the origin of life on Earth was a 1 in a trillion chance shot. And, you know, it's like winning the lottery. How do you know whether, if you've won the lottery and you have never spoken to anyone else outside of your house, how do you know whether that's a sure bet that everyone experiences or whether you were 1 in a billion? Okay? If you go check with your neighbor and they've also won the lottery, you can assume that it's a pretty common experience. On the other hand, if you check around the neighborhood and no one else has ever won the lottery, you can say, gee, I'm pretty lucky.
Yeah, I'll say.
So there's the science. Now, then there's the challenge. You know, I think humans are like societies are like individuals. We grow when we challenge ourselves. We stagnate when we don't. The Humans to Mars program would be a tremendous positive bracing challenge to every society that participates, particularly to the youth. It would say to every young person, learn your science. You can be a pioneer in new worlds. Out of that challenge, we'd get millions of young scientists, engineers, inventors, technological entrepreneurs, medical researchers, the works. These are the kind of people that drive society forward. If you want to create intellectual capital, the way you do it is by challenging youth, not by brutalizing them with perpetual testing, which is apparently what Washington thinks can work. And then finally, there's the future. I mean, really, if we do this, then 500 years from now, there'll be new branches of human civilization, not only on Mars, but on thousands of planets orbiting stars in this region of the galaxy. And when they look back at this time, what will they consider as important? When we look back 500 years, what do we consider important? You ask any American what happened in 1492, it's Christopher Columbus. Nobody says, well, in 1492, the Borgias took over the papacy, which they did. And that would have been the big headliner if there had been big-time newspapers in 1492. England, France signed a peace treaty in 1492. Who knows that? Okay, you know, lots of things happened in 1492 that no one today cares about or knows about. But Columbus matters to us because he made us possible. Okay, and similarly, you know, 500 years from now, nobody's going to care which gang of thugs came out on top in Syria, you know, or you know, who won or who lost various political gang warfare fights. But what we did to make the future spacefaring civilization of humanity possible, that's what's going to matter. Okay, I mean, this time will be remembered because this is when we first set sail for other worlds.
Robert, I want to touch a little bit on the sort of psychological and sociological aspects of the mission, to go, you know, back a little bit down into the micro. Question one, which we just haven't touched on yet, is how long would the trip to Mars be? But once you've answered that, which I know you'll be able to do in very short order, talk to me a little bit about the expected psychological and sociological issues that might come up in terms of a duration with this level of isolation, a small group of people for a year and a half on Mars, plus the travel time.
Well, the flight plan is 6 months out, year and a half on the surface, 6 months back. So 2.5 years away from Earth, but only 6 months traveling to Mars one way. And now that's a standard rotation on the space station. People do that all the time. And people have done much rougher things in the past. I mean, look, Anne Frank and her family were in an attic for 2.5 years surrounded by Nazis. And those were ordinary people chosen by circumstances, not chosen for maximum psychological, you know, toughness or anything of the sort. So people can deal with this, and they have dealt with much tougher stuff than this. I think the human factors problem of a human Mars mission is extremely overdrawn.
In what particular way? What aspect of it do you think is getting maybe more attention than it deserves?
Well, I think, you know, first of all, there's been some studies where they take some people who, with limited selection, put them in a habitat for, one case in Moscow, for 500 days with nothing to do. That's an isolation study. You put people in a newspaper office with nothing to do. In a month, you'd show pathologies, okay? But a Mars mission is not going to have nothing to do. A Mars mission is going to have all kinds of great stuff to do. They're going to be exploring a new world. You know, I mean, really, the problem they're going to have, if they have a psychological problem, will be overwork, because they're going to be driving themselves to try to accomplish the maximum they can in the limited amount of time they have on Mars, which has been provided to them at enormous expense by society. So, and, you know, we actually see this ourselves. The Mars Society has 2 practice Mars bases, one in the desert, one in the Arctic. And we task them to do programs of exploration. And these are scientists, they want to be there. They're not like Navy crews in Antarctica that are exiled who want to really be in San Diego on the waterfront, you know, where they can go to nightclubs on the weekend leave. I mean, no, these are people in their element, and they're explorers, and they want to be there. They would devote their careers for a chance to be there. And they also know, all of them know, that if they make it back, they're made people. You know, they're going to get put on corporate boards. They're going to have advertising endorsements. They'll be rich. You know, Apollo astronauts, a lot of people, they would write checks. People wouldn't even cash their checks. They'd want to keep the check so they'd have their autograph.
Huh.
So there you have it. So I just don't buy it. I mean, in World War II, millions of Americans were away from home for 3 years, eating crap food and sitting in muddy trenches and being, brutalized by 90-day wonders and drill sergeants and with Nazis or Japanese trying to kill them. And they handled it. This is a walk in the park compared to that.
Wow. Robert, last thing I want to touch on, given all of the proposals that are currently sort of out there, given what we know about the different proposed timelines of different projects, what's your best guess as to what year a human will first step foot on Mars?
I think that we can do it in the late 2020s. From a technical point of view, we can be on Mars in 8 years. What it takes is the will. Right now, I'm seeing more will from SpaceX than from NASA, although NASA, frankly, is better equipped to do it. They have much more resources. But where there's a will, there's a way. And where there's not a will, there's not a way.
We've been speaking with Robert Zubrin, the Mars Direct Project. He is an aerospace engineer and author. Fascinating, Robert. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We already knew that Donald Trump's son-in-law and advisor Jared Kushner had undisclosed meetings with Russian ambassador to the U.S. Sergei Kislyak, but we now have learned, according to U.S. officials, that one of the things that was discussed during those meetings was setting up a secret communications channel between Trump's transition team and the Kremlin using a Russian consulate in the United States in order specifically to bypass monitoring by U.S. intelligence. They talked about this in a meeting at Trump Tower at the beginning of December. According to the leak, Kushner told the Russians that he wanted to do this because meeting in public would look bad for the Trump transition team. So this is important for a number of reasons. Number one, we are now talking about specific actions by individuals who work at the White House. We're talking about White House advisors. That's number one. Number two, this shows intent, right? The entire point would be to avoid having public knowledge of certain types of meetings. And it also is sort of incompetence because do you think that the Russian consulate isn't being monitored by American intelligence in terms of who's going in and out or communications that are happening there? So it's really like a trifecta of incompetence here. Disgraced former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who was forced to resign because of his own problems with Russian meetings, was at this meeting. Never a good thing, probably not a surprise. And U.S. intelligence found out about the existence of the plan. This is amazing. When Kislyak told his superiors in Russia, think about that for a second, we found out about what Jared Kushner was scheming by by virtue of Kislyak reporting it to his superiors in Russia, and once again confirming previous assertions from the media. The Washington Post already had received a letter in mid-December saying, this is what happened, it wasn't confirmed. Now it's been confirmed. Apparently the Russians thought, this isn't really a great idea. Kislyak himself was reportedly surprised and hesitant about doing this. Kushner's suggestion was too shady for the Russians. When a suspected Russian spy recruiter says, you might be going too far, Jared, you've got to be doing something really fringe.
Yeah, especially because this allegedly happened right after it was clear that Russia meddled with our election.
Yeah.
So you'd think that if the Trump administration was innocent when it comes to colluding with the Russians or just wanted to give that appearance,
yes,
that they would avoid doing something as brazen as this?
Well, that's why this appears to be sort of the closest thing to evidence of collusion or attempted collusion. We don't know whether this line of communication was ever set up. This is the closest thing to evidence of collusion that has become public so far. And the reaction has been pretty aggressive. Current and former U.S. intel officials who have been consulted say this would have been insanely naive on Jared Kushner's part because it would require someone from the Trump campaign or a surrogate to physically go in and out of a Russian diplomatic office on a regular basis, which, again, as I mentioned, would be monitored by American intelligence. It would be characteristic of Trump's team to do something before thinking it through and weighing the consequences. But here's the just amazing quote. Former acting CIA director John McLaughlin told MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell, quote, "I can't keep out of my mind the thought that if an American intelligence officer had done anything like this, we'd consider it espionage." This was not an American intelligence officer. This was Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. But it's all part of the larger motif of Trump team members trying to cover up communications with Russia. And we come back to this time and again, Pat. If nothing is going on, why are they only covering up or attempting to cover up communications with Russian actors?
It's also hard to believe that Kushner did this unilaterally. I think he must have been doing the bidding of someone else because, of course, Kushner is a young guy. He's not very experienced. And he also has great job security being the son of the president.
So if
there was anyone to do it, it would be him.
Imagine if he doesn't have the job security that we assume he has. That could get interesting pretty quick. We'll continue following it. Hey, special snowflake Donald Trump fled to a safe space. Is it fleed or fled?
Fled.
Oh, it's fled.
I don't know.
Fleed? I'm not sure. Anyway, special snowflake Trump went to a safe space and canceled a speech at the Israeli Knesset to avoid being heckled. You'll remember that Donald Trump was in Israel last week. He was apparently so triggered by the possibility of being heckled during a speech that he abruptly canceled it. Trump was scheduled to address the Israeli parliament called the Knesset, but Israel's Speaker of the House, Yuli Edelstein, told an Israeli radio station that the Trump administration canceled the speech because self-pitying Trump was just afraid of the response that he would get during the trip. Even though Trump has tried so hard to seem pro-Israel during his trip and during his campaign and while being president, he's actually very unpopular among many members of the Knesset, which is kind of pathetic in and of itself. Speaker of the Knesset, Yuli Edelstein, said to Israeli Army radio, quote, "The possibility was explored as a first option, and it was dropped from the agenda because it was clear that the president wouldn't be able to speak." Instead, Donald Trump went to Safe Space Israel Museum in Jerusalem, which was, I guess, a much more comfortable environment for him, where people weren't going to be mean and things would be much easier and calmer for him. Past presidents have spoken to Israel's parliament during their visits. It's sort of a tradition, but also past presidents were able to read well and didn't mock disabled reporters on camera. So we're seeing a lot of firsts under the Trump presidency. Wasn't Trump the tough guy, Pat? Trumpzilla. He can handle anything. He can tell people what's what. And yet he doesn't want to be heckled, so he bails.
I think this is the ultimate irony of these alt-right types, which is that they are the special snowflakes. And they obviously view Trump as their alpha.
Not exactly working out that way. And this is similar to the whole White House Correspondents' Dinner thing, which presidents almost always attend. And Trump said it was something about, what was the explanation he gave for why he wasn't going? That there's more important things to be doing or something.
Maybe he had
like
that rally planned. He had that big rally in front of all of his supporters.
He had to give a campaign rally or something like that. I actually thought when I read this, well, Trump's going to make up for this by doing a campaign rally where his own security can just throw out protesters. And case in point, next week, Trump is doing one of these rallies, even though the campaign is over, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Walking punchline here. We have a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. This is a voicemail from arguably the biggest football fan in David Pakman Show audience history, Grady, who was interested in Pat's comments about fanny packs last week.
Hey, David, it's Grady. I hope you had a fantastic Memorial Day weekend. But this message is for Fanny Pack Pat. No, Fanny Pack Pat. I just want to say, Fanny Pack Pat, you have totally earned your place on the show in my heart. You are not Lewis, and Lewis will always be Lewis, but you have earned your place in my opinion. So I just want to say, great job, you guys. It's a fantastic show, and I hope you have a glorious summer. And just live your life.
Right.
Ciao, ciao.
Grady clearly has more time on his hands now that the Cowboys are in the offseason. Could you have predicted that your pro-fanny pack statements could have had such an impact on the audience?
That I could have predicted, but I had thought that Grady had my approval all along.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or I had heard, I didn't realize it took this long.
Well, listen, sometimes there are challenges in life.
Okay.
And sometimes we overcome them. And clearly that has happened as far as Grady is concerned.
And I can keep a list of those challenges in my fanny pack so I know when to deal with them.
And on our Reddit is covered in fanny pack related memes now. And anyway, check that out. On the bonus show today, golfer Tiger Woods arrested on DUI charges in Jupiter, Florida. More problems at Chipotle, and I'll tell some stories from Montreal. All of that on the bonus show, davidpakman.com/membership to sign up and get instant access.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.